You're listening to INTERZONE Pod. My name is Gareth Jelley. I'm the editor of INTERZONE and its sister zine, IZ Digital. You can find out more about INTERZONE at interzone.press and more about IZ Digital at interzone.digital. Today's show is a special episode all about the late, great Eric Brown. Joining me today to talk about Eric Brown are Una McCormack, Keith Brooke, and Tony Ballantyne. Thank you all for coming together to talk today for this this kind of special episode of the INTERZONE podcast about Eric Brown. And I thought just for listeners at the beginning, if you could kind of introduce yourselves so people can hear who you are.
Hello, my name's Una McCormack and I write science fiction, and I co-wrote a couple of books with Eric.
Hi, I'm Keith Brooke and I've been writing with Eric pretty much since we first met in 1989. We've written several books together and lots of short stories, and we've collaborated on all kinds of things over the years.
Hi, I'm Tony. I'm also a science fiction writer, and I think I met Eric in about 2000. We've written a couple of short stories together, and we've spent a lot of social time together.
Thank you very much. First of all, do you each remember when you first read Eric Brown's work, and also when you first met him?
I first read Eric's work when he started publishing short fiction in INTERZONE in the mid to late 80s, and he was one of the rising new stars, and I was a little bit in awe of him at the time. And then we ended up in an anthology together, edited by Chris Evans and Rob Holdstock, and we went down to a big signing event in London, and I met Eric there for the first time, and we were both not the most sociable people, so we both sat at a table in the corner and chatted for most of the day instead of doing all the stuff we were supposed to do. And ever since then.
And Tony?
I was first aware of Eric from INTERZONE, actually, from his stories there as well. In fact, I remember seeing an interview which was with Eric and Keith at the same time. I remember reading that. That was when I was trying to become an SF writer myself. And then I met him properly in 2000 at the convention in Glasgow. We were both up for a BSFA award. He actually won it, the swine, at the time. And I went up and introduced myself to him, and he was just a great guy. He introduced me to a lot of other people that day, including Keith. Since then, a lot of the people I've met in SF has been through Eric.
Oh, okay. And Una?
I'm pretty sure I met Eric in the pub. Yeah. And this must have been about 2010. Possibly, no, probably a little bit earlier, maybe sort of 2008. And a group of us were in the Cambridge area, and Ian Waits at Newcom Press, who knows absolutely everybody, he said, "Oh, there's a handful of us around Cambridge now. Let's meet in the pub." So we arranged to meet at a pub in Cambridge called the Pickerel, which is opposite Magdalen College, and Eric was there, and that's how I got to know Eric, and when I started reading him as well. So I'd mostly been reading kind of tie-in stuff before that, but that's when I started reading Eric. Yeah, so in the pub, I think that's about right, isn't it?
and sort of, yeah, at the pub, what were your first impressions and your first memories kind of getting to know him?
Extremely courteous, extremely gentle, and then with this absolutely wicked sense of humour and a really sharp eye. You felt you were with someone extremely smart and extremely unpretentious, and someone who used their powers for good.
I like that. Tony?
Yeah, I'd agree with what Una just said. He took a great interest in people, and he'd always ask you, he was genuinely interested in what you were doing, what you were writing, what you were thinking about, which was great. But also he was very very educated about science fiction. He knew, he'd read lots of books, he had opinions on them all, and he knew what made them work. He was a great source of advice about just about everything. He was one of my first readers for my stories, and he gave me invaluable advice over the time. I will really miss the fact that he's not there to give me feedback now.
I think what Una said about him being unpretentious rang very true for me. There was absolutely nothing fake or superficial about Eric. He engaged with people. He loved literature of all sorts, and he wanted to get out of people, whether they were writing, reading, gardening, football or beer. He was just engaged.
Or Marmite.
Definitely. He had the world's best collection of yeast extract containers. Ever since I knew him, he was trying to sell a book on yeast extracts of the world.
I mean, is there a manuscript somewhere for that?
I'm not sure if he put anything down on paper for it, but he did talk to every editor who he could corner about it.
And the kind of knowledge of SF, did he kind of recommend books that are there kind of like books that you found through him basically?
He was always recommending writers. Once he got to know somebody, he'd latch on a writer that they might not have discovered. He'd say, "Oh, you really need to read this person," and he was a great champion of writers who'd had their bursts of success and then were forgotten decades later. It was always people like Michael Coney, Rupert Croft Cook, all sorts of writers.
Yeah, he was
somebody to recommend.
Yeah, Rupert Croft Cook. He had a very large collection of his things, and he was very disappointed when I didn't like one of his books. But he recommended people like Patrick Hamilton, who it's right, Patrick Hamilton, isn't it? The guy who did the Gaslighting play originally, but also wrote a lot of novels. So not SF at all, but I've been reading those books and very much enjoying them. Anything from the first half of the 20th century was a very big fan of.
And was it Michael Coney you mentioned, Keith?
Michael Coney, yeah. Eric was a huge fan of Michael Coney's work and eventually made contact with him. Michael Coney was living on the west coast of Canada, and Eric made contact with him, and they exchanged letters and then I think emails. It was a bad day, and then they ended up collaborating on stories. And I think Eric helped get some of Michael's out of print works back into print for him.
There was a PS edition, I think, wasn't there, of like a reissue? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Eric helped put everybody in touch to make things like that happen.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool. What about you, Una? Are there books that you kind of took away from conversations?
But that's one of those questions that immediately goes, can't think of anything. But I think probably I would want to say to bear in mind his role as a reviewer. He was reviewing science fiction in The Guardian for how long would it be? How long did he have that for? That reviewing job? He
was reviewing. They did one paperback review a month.
Yeah.
And Eric did that for probably, 5 or 6 years, I think.
Yeah.
And then I think John Courtney Grimwood had the monthly review slot where they reviewed about 4 books a month.
Yeah.
And John left that and Eric took that on. And Eric lined me up for the paperback review slot. And I did the paperback reviews for 10 years. And Eric was doing the full column for all of that time and then a couple of years more. So it must have been about 12 years at the Guardian, doing the full reviews at the Guardian, and 5 or 6 before that.
Yeah.
So a long time.
So prodigiously well read. And that's just in science fiction. I think, like both of you were saying, that wasn't just all that he read. We should remember he was a crime novelist as well, of course. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
As well as everything else, and children's book writer. But the crime novels, I mean, half a dozen, I think, of the Langham and Duprés.
He wanted to write the 10th one.
Yeah.
He knew he wanted to write for the 10th one that would bring the series to a close, but he never got to do that.
No. Is there anything in note form, Keith? Does anything exist in note form?
I don't know for the Langham and Dupré, the 10th book. When he was writing those, I only ever got to see them after he'd written a draft. So I don't know what he was planning to do for that. I might ask Finn whether there's anything for that, just out of curiosity to know what was going to happen.
Yeah.
Una, can you kind of introduce that series? Because I'm not very familiar with that one.
So it's a crime series set in the 50s, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think Dupré is a literary agent and Langham is a novelist. There's often novelists as the leads in Eric's books. And they're kind of old-fashioned crime in a way, but they're I think because it's Eric, they're stylish in this sort of unfussy way. So it's a classic setup, really, isn't it? A sort of a double act like that, but with this wonderful 50s setting. That I think that's the thing with crime, isn't it? Once the mobile phone's invented, it kind of wrecks crime novels. Yeah, so you have to go back to kind of period pieces, I think. But yeah, that kind of sort of that stylish classic sort of detective fiction.
Eric was immersed in that period as well. That he loved was from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So he was never one for research. That was a running joke that I had with him. That if he wanted research, he tended to leave gaps and ask me what I thought quite often. But then when it came to the Langham and Dupré books, because he was so immersed in that period, he didn't need to do research, but he often did quite a lot of research for them because he really loved reading all of the old books, going around second-hand bookshops and finding some undiscovered novel from the 1950s. He just loved that kind of thing.
He would have fitted very well in the Backlisted podcast, I think, where they kind of discover old books. They've just done their 200th episode on a barely known Neville Shute novel.
Oh.
His last novel from the 60s. It struck me as exactly the kind of thing that I think Eric would have read and enjoyed and gone, oh yeah, I knew that one. That was a good one.
Yeah.
God, I've never heard of this one before.
Well, I think I've just read that one actually just recently. It was on Amazon. Yeah, it was a.
Which one is that?
I can't remember. It's the guy. He's retired and he heads off to help somebody across the world.
Trusty with a toolbox, I think.
You've been on that podcast, right, Una? But I don't know which book it was.
I've done some science fiction and some. I've done some. I've done Terence Dicks's Doctor Who and the Brain of Morbius.
Oh right, okay, good choice.
And Lord of the Rings and other ones as well. I've done some Anita Bruckner and Ballet Shoes, all sorts. We've done Ridley Walker. I think probably is the most. On some William Golding as well. I think I've done for them, which is kind of mid-list. I was just rereading. I've been going through a lot of Eric's stuff today and the past few days, of course, and I'd completely forgotten about his longer story about the Neanderthals, the time travel one about the Neanderthals. It's in one of his early collections. It's called The Inheritors of Earth, and it's a lovely time travel. It's sort of H.G. Wells pops up as a character in it. I think he was just very well versed in his genre. And not just, as Keith was saying, not just in the genre that he mainly wrote in, but in all these byways of sort of mid-century, I guess we call it middlebrow fiction. And he just knew it well and loved it and deployed that in his own writing.
He wrote in a lot of different genres and the series that the kind of world that you wrote in, the weird space world. And the pair of books that you've described as feminist Lovecraftian space operas, which is wonderful. How did it go from sort of meeting him in the pub to working with him on those?
I think that was his series. He came up with that, which was this sort of Lovecraftian space opera setup. So it was a far future setup post an intergalactic war between a kind of Earth civilization called the Expansion and an alien antagonist called the Vetch. But that war is sort of cast aside when these sort of cosmic horror creatures, the weird, start to appear on the scene. And Eric had done. Eric had set it all up. It was all his invention. And then I think he'd done 2 books, and that was enough for him. And because it had been conceived as a shared world, I think he suggested my name. We'd been, meeting at the Pickerel for a while by then, and that was really significant for me because that was still very early on in my career, and to sort of have someone like Eric, who was so well established and so well respected, to have him sort of put your name forward for something like that. And then I would kind of bounce ideas at him, and he would go, "Oh, I hadn't really thought that would be part of it. But do you know what? You should just do what you want." There was no kind of ownership or preciousness about it. He just said, "You run with what you want with this because you're taking this forwards now." So there was no sort of, you think of other shared world situations, and it's, but people are picking over it, and you're not allowed to sort of colour outside the lines or anything. But Eric was just go ahead.
Sort of create your own lines.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that series was conceived as a shared world, and then kind of is it open in a sense, or has it come to a close? Has the story sort of finished?
I think I managed to. I remember sending in. I did one co-written with Eric called The Baba Yaga, and then I did one called Star of the Sea. And I remember handing that into the editor, and he said, "I think you've finished this universe." I'm sorry about that.
Oops.
That wasn't the oops. Yeah, that wasn't the intention.
It's not very often you get to sort of destroy the whole universe. It's yeah.
He possibly shouldn't have trusted me with it.
Tony, what about you? You worked with Eric on a story in the Kathani collection, Matthew's Passion.
Yeah, that's right.
Was that's the kind of first sort of shared credit, and then there was the Microcosms, this sort of double collection, which I think is a great idea that I'm surprised more people don't do. But yeah, what's the kind of history of you and Eric sort of working on each of the stories and working together?
We talked about working together on things, but it never really seemed to work. I've had the same thing with other writers. There are people like Keith and Eric who just click straight away and can do it, but whenever I've tried it, it never seems to work so well. However, I'd read one of Eric's Kathani stories in INTERZONE, and it blew me away. I think his Kathani stories are probably my favourite of all the things he's done. It's just one of those ideas which is so perfect when you get it. You could just keep extending it. It's the sort of idea that I think every writer would like to get. And I'd had an idea for the first part of the Matthew's Passion story, and I sent it off to him. And he did the next bit, and then I did the next bit, and I set him like an impossible problem, one I didn't think he'd be able to resolve. And he did it in like 2 lines, and it was a work of genius. It was just like, I just thought, wow, when he did it. And I was being deliberately obnoxious when I did it, but it was just so good. The Microcosms shorts, the Microcosms collection, that was Eric's idea. It was a brilliant one. We've both been talking, we've both written quite a few flash fiction stories. I think a lot of them have been in The New Scientist, and things like that, daily science fiction when it used to run. Mm-hmm. And Eric had the idea of collecting them together. And he put it to Keith, who published it with Infinity Plus, who suggested some things to do with the form. And it just worked so well. But I couldn't say it was a proper collaboration, really, because we both put our own stories in it, and then we introduced each other afterwards, which was a shame, because we got on so well. But it's probably me. It's actually, it will be me. Eric is perfectly capable of collaborating. it doesn't seem to work out when they try it.
Yeah, I've had a few conversations recently with writers where for some writers, sort of conceptually, it's quite hard just to sort of sit down and think about it. And I think I think Keith, there's the story you tell in the interview is kind of, I think you were leaving the pub with Eric and he sort of couldn't imagine the idea of collaborating, and then you ended up collaborating on a huge amount together. How did it go from, I think it was The Girl Who Loved Beethoven, which became Appassionata, and then how did all that kind of come about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might have been that first meeting at the signing in London where one of the things Eric and I talked about was how collaborations just don't work. How could you possibly trust another writer enough with something that you've written to let them hack it about, change it completely, and come up with a completely new direction? And we were both in complete agreement that we could never end up collaborating with other writers because we were far too precious about the whole process. And then we carried on in that position until we reached a point, probably a couple of years later, when had a deadline for a novel that he had to finish, and he'd just written a quick short story. Why it didn't work, and he knew that by the time he'd written this novel, he probably would never come back to the short story, that he didn't understand why it didn't work. And he showed me the story, and I just very tentatively, because obviously collaborations, I said, well, if you're really not going to do anything more with it, it'd be a shame to throw away what's the basis of a really interesting story. I think we should do this, this, and this. And he just said, well, if you've got time, do you want to do it? And so I did. And then I think I probably waited several months for him to finish the draft of the novel, showed him what I'd done, and he completely redid what I'd done. And then I redid what he did until we reached a draft that we were both happy with. And then we suddenly sat back and realized we'd collaborated. We wanted to do another one from scratch. And that turned into... I don't know how many short stories and novellas we've done now, but it's a lot of words together. Definitely came from that one agreement that we couldn't possibly work like that.
Did writing that way change the way you thought about writing, generally, but your own kind of solo writing as well?
I think even though through all the years I always said that even the work that came out under our own names was a collaboration to one extent or another, because we exchanged almost everything we did and came up with suggestions and critiques for it. I think it's only in this year that I've realised just quite to what an extent that was true. I've really struggled to write this year, because I keep reaching points where I would just send an email off to Eric and say, well, I'm doing this, what do you think? Or show him drafts or bounce ideas off him. I'm actually collaborating with him at the moment. We are halfway through a series of novellas for PS Publishing. We'd written the first two novellas, and there were two more in the series to go. And the last time I saw Eric, I went up to visit him, and we had a lovely time bouncing ideas around for what we'd write in the last two novellas in the series. And then we bounced a few emails around with notes from those discussions, and then we never managed to write them together. But one of the last things he asked me to do was finish this series. And so all year I've been putting off sitting down to write these books, because I knew it would be one of the toughest things I've ever done. And in the last month or so, I've started writing the third of these novellas. And like Tony said, he reached an impasse with his story, and Eric solved it in 2 lines. I realised that part of our process was that with these novellas, I would write it until I reached a point where it was so hard I didn't know what to do next, and I'd send it to Eric. He'd just take it, solve it in a flash, and send it back to me. So I always thought I was giving him the problems, but he always did exactly the same. So he would pick it up and run with it until he reached a point where he didn't know how to write the next bit, and he'd feel really guilty for sending it to me to fix. And I'm now in this position where I'm reaching the hard parts of this novella that I'm working on, and reaching the points where I would have sent them to Eric to do all the hard stuff. And I can't cop out now. I've got to actually do the hard bits as well. It's much more difficult.
Yeah, that does sound very difficult. But you said that in the last month you've been making progress on that one.
Yes. I've been accumulating notes for it all year, and found out and thought actually it was thinking what Eric would have advised me to do if I was having problems writing, and he would have just said, "Trust yourself. Mm-hmm. Sit down at the screen, start typing, and just trust your instinct. You've been doing this for 30 or 40 years. You know how to write stories. Just write it and see what happens." And so that's what I started doing, and that was exactly the right approach, because it's still, I'm writing it much more slowly than I would normally write, but the story is coming, and I'm seeing those notes that we had suddenly being fleshed out on the screen, and I'm finding the little surprises that we would have surprised each other with, mm-hmm. which is lovely. So yeah, the books will come out.
Well, that's I mean, it sounds like a really a big responsibility to be finishing that off.
It is, because I want to do them justice. I don't want to just fulfill a contract. I want to try to push myself to make them the books that they would have been if we'd still been working together. And I've no idea if I managed to achieve that, but I want to feel that I've given it the best shot. It does put extra pressures on writing a book rather than just sitting down and making things up.
Tony, you've said in the past that you've talked about kind of Eric's sort of I think you called it his knack for making character-driven science fiction look easy when it very much isn't. I kind of wonder. Yeah, and Una, I remember you saying that you kind of feel that, you know, Eric's work is criminally underrated, and you mentioned something before about the sort of the way that, you know, the sort of the unpretentiousness of the way he wrote. Is that something? Well, I suppose it's two questions, but yeah, are there particular kind of stories of Eric's that stick in your minds, you know, because of that, and also. Just generally, what do you enjoy about Eric's writing?
Well, I think Kathani is just absolutely wonderful. It's a incredibly moving book, and I know it was short stories, but really when you read it, it feels like a unified whole. Mm-hmm. Don't they call it a fix-it novel?
Fix up, yeah.
Fix up, thank you. You don't feel it reading Kathani. It's just this. So that the premise is that aliens arrive and they bring the gift of immortality, but it's centered around a small group of friends in a small Yorkshire town who regularly meet up at a pub, and the impact of this philosophical change in humanity's way of being in the world and in the universe. So on this very, very small scale, you see this absolutely cosmic change unfold, and it's a very, very deep novel. On a sentence level, it's very unfussy. It's not careless. It's very, very careful. It's extremely crafted. It's just a wonderful book. I think there are a handful of books he writes about around that time, aren't there? The Serene Invasion deals with aliens arrive and humans are no longer able to kill or commit acts of violence. Mm-hmm. And there's a handful of books then that I think are particularly sort of philosophical in thinking about how humanity. There's this great faith that, or trust possibly, that humanity has the seeds to be better and to be fuller. And I think particularly in those two books, you see that thought through. And in a careful and crafted and intelligent way. Kathani's wonderful, and it should be on top 10 lists, you know.
Tony, what about you? Yeah, sort of either specific books or just sort of elements in the writing that really that you kind of just admire, I suppose.
The generally, we've already said it's the characters. When I started writing, I made a conscious decision to do hard SF. I thought that'd be the most saleable, and Eric was doing the complete opposite of that. Eric was not a technical person. In fact, I was thinking about this before we came along. There's Keith might remember this. Years ago, we went out drinking, probably in Bradford or somewhere like that, and I gave him a lift in my car. We had a little red Micra, and I don't know if Keith can remember this, but we went to the pub. We came back afterwards, and me and Keith went to our car, and we'd lost Eric, and we were looking around the car park trying to see where he was, and he'd gone and he was stood next to this massive 4x4, across the other side of the car park, and I just couldn't stop laughing because it was the most unlike car to the one which I had. I thought that just summed up Eric beautifully. And it wasn't the only time he did it. There were several times, anyway, it always amused me. But, so his science fiction was not technical, but it didn't matter. There are a lot of great writing. In fact, the mistake people make is to concentrate on that sort of thing. His characters just are always wonderful. No matter what they were just genuinely interested. I always remember he used to just describe what they were having to eat, and I was even vaguely fascinated by that, and their thoughts and the reactions to the world which they were living in. That's what makes good writing. That's what it's all about, and he did it so effortlessly. And then he would just throw in a few casual details. It was one of his. I remember he had a spaceship. It just appeared over over the ocean. It flickered in and out of existence, and then there it was, and it landed afterwards. I love those little touches, but it always came back to the people.
I think there's a kind of cosmopolitan aspect to his writing as well. I mean, he was very well travelled, wasn't he? And I think this sort of his what we've been saying earlier about his interest in everything. This comes down onto the page that details are not missed. And they're recorded. I believe his descriptions of the alien as much as I believe his descriptions of the quotidian. Yeah,
right.
You felt he's been there too. Yeah, yeah.
I think he was fascinated by people. I mean, Una said he was very cosmopolitan. He was well travelled. He wasn't just well travelled. He didn't go on holidays. He went and lived in places.
Exactly.
So he lived in India for extended periods. He lived in Australia. He used to work in these places. So when he was in India, I remember the last trip he did to India, he was somewhere in the north, in charge of I think it was a punt. So he was there on the back of a boat with his pole, taking tourists around the lake in India, and he did these kind of things so that he could meet the tourists and extract their stories. He always used to take a travel chess set when he was in India, not because he was a particularly good chess player, but because he knew that if he was on a bus or sitting in a park or in a street or a cafe, and he took a chess set out and started a game with himself, within minutes, somebody would come up and say, "Oh, it's much better playing with somebody else." And he'd sit down and he would lose chess to all kinds of people just by doing that. But he would talk to them and get their stories. He ran youth hostels. And one of his favourite things was sort of late at night at the youth hostel in Haworth, where the sort of stragglers and late arrivals would turn up, and it would be way beyond normal meal times, but he'd rustle something up from the kitchen and sit down with them and just talk about their day and what they've been doing and what their lives were. And he was fascinated by them, and he just wanted to hear their stories. And I think that came across in his writing, that he could write these believable people with believable stories that you cared about, because he cared about them.
He wrote women very well as well, just the other aliens. He was good at writing women. And writing in a woman's point of view as well, he was confident and competent at as well. He was good at it. Not everyone is. Yeah.
Yeah, and not in SF as well. That's not always. It's not a very long list. Maybe. Keith, you mentioned in an interview a while back, and maybe Tony, this is something you've got thoughts on as well. But you mentioned that you thought then that you could sort of roughly categorize SF authors into two groups: those who do SF and those who use it. And and how you and Keith, and how you and Eric were using SF, to tell stories where the plot and the characters were central. But on the other hand, I kind of feel like the big ideas are sometimes internal ideas, and so you have these sort of the big ideas are not always outside the self, right? But is that do you still see that division sort of or that distinction?
I think it's a very crude and fuzzy division, but definitely an observation that I've made. And I think one of the key things with Eric is that he could come up with surprising, fantastical science fictional ideas. But whereas some writers would concentrate on those ideas and extrapolating those ideas, Eric's concern was with the impact they had on characters. And so he didn't really care about the mechanics of how something worked or why it worked. He had the idea that it might work that way, and then he looked at the impact and how it affected people. So either if he was using the sort of established tropes of SF like faster than light travel or aliens, or whether he was coming with some fantastic idea that nobody had ever come across before, he would then move on to using that idea to write about his characters rather than just look at the idea. And it's a very crude description, I think. But Eric was more towards that end of the spectrum, whereas other writers might be more concerned with wowing people with the ideas and the mechanics of convincing them that they could possibly work.
I think I always feel he has an affinity with writers like Wells or Stapleton. I think there's a lot of Stapleton in there. And maybe even C.S. Lewis to some extent, those planetary romances. That you kind of feel that if he'd been publishing in the 50s, he would have been a much more mainstream read author. I don't know whether that kind of rings true for you, Keith and Tony. That he's in a sort of tradition of scientific romance as much as science fiction, and that 20 or 30 or 40 years earlier he would have been more widely read, whereas I think science fiction had maybe got a bit ghettoized by the 80s.
I think Eric would probably have agreed with that. I think he described his own work in those terms sometimes, that it was he loved the writings of that era, the planetary romances, rather than sort of hard science fiction. And he might even have written more what would have been contemporary work then, because that's where he sets a lot of his non-science fictional work, was in those periods, or in sort of late Victorian period as well. He was comfortable writing in that kind of setting. And I can't imagine that if he was writing in the 50s, he would have been sort of writing stuff from transposed 50 years earlier. I think he would have just been comfortable with that era.
Kings of Eternity would be a book for people to read to sort of sample this, I think. Rereading it reminded me a lot of Susanna Clarke's Piranesi, actually. It felt like it had a lot in common with that.
Tony, did you want to come in there?
Oh, I think Una made an excellent point about if Eric had been around in the 50s. That would be very interesting. But yeah, I always think there's a spectrum of SF, probably of all writing. I sometimes think it's like those Haynes user manuals, those Haynes books they have for cars, when they show how to fix your cars and stuff. And in a certain way, they are fascinating. I will look at them, and they are quite interesting. But obviously, they're not fiction; they're not books. And I sometimes think, there is some science fiction. People like Larry Niven and those sort of people who are more at that end of things. And to be honest, I do like that sort of SF myself. But Eric was very much at the other end of that spectrum when he was doing things. I think that's the joy of SF. We can all enjoy those things together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree.
You've mentioned some titles already, but maybe for people who are listening who are completely new to Eric Brown, what are your personal favourites or your recommendations for where readers should start?
Well, I would say Cathani and The Kings of Eternity. I think they're both really good books, and sort of two different flavours. One much more Kings of Eternity, much more a sort of old school scientific romance, and Cathani, a sort of philosophical meditation on humanity's place in the cosmos. Kind of Wells and Stapleton.
That's a nice way of putting it.
I'd agree on those two, and I'm going to say something now which I don't think Keith could say, but I'd also recommend that people read some of Eric and Keith's work which they did together, because that was very much a part of what Eric did, and obviously what Keith did as well. And there's just some great stuff there. The two of them deserve to be read. It's excellent stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I would agree with everything that's been said so far, obviously. Genuinely, I would have picked out Kings of Eternity and the Cathani stories as first choices. My first thought was the short fiction. He's published lots of collections of short stories over the years, and if you want to see the range of the kinds of stories that he wrote and the quality of them, then going back to his first collection, The Time-Lapse Man and Other Stories, that was just, I hate to say revolutionary in its time, but it was a real eye-opener in the British science fiction field in the late 80s, early 90s when those stories were coming out.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the Langham and Dupré crime series, because I think they're probably the best things he's written, although it's hard to choose. They're my favourites of what he's written. And I think to most people, if you mention Eric Brown, they probably wouldn't think of 1950s crime stories, certainly as a first thought. But they were lovely books.
Just one thing as well, just to add on, Eric did books for reluctant readers.
Yeah.
I'm not really recommending those unless, of course, people are reluctant readers. But they were excellent. He wrote. It was a very difficult thing which he did. He wrote books for like 18-year-olds who didn't have very good reading skills. So he had to write something which an 18-year-old could understand and get behind, but with the correct language of somebody who couldn't read that well. That's a very difficult thing to do, and they were popular. It was, in fact, he did a version. I don't think it was Reluctant Readers, but he did versions of War of the Worlds and a couple of H.G. Wells things. Cut down versions. And for a time, that was my kids' favourite books. When they were younger.
Yeah, that was with a lot of that was with Barrington Stoke, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Barrington Stoke, those are the ones. Yes.
It's an unbelievably skilled thing to do, and shows a kind of mastery of storytelling. I think that you can keep the attention of someone who is, not a natural reader or an instinctive reader. Really skillful.
I had a friend who, for a time, worked in the prison service in education, and he said that those the Barrington Stoke books, not just Eric's, but that series, were very popular and very successful in the prison education service, because often they had people who had reading problems or educational problems for all kinds of reasons, and they were a great way to get them into reading and discovering books.
And kind of sort of wrapping things up, Una, you've described Eric as being a very generous writer to work with, and Tony, in your intro to Microcosms, you said how he was a valuable source of advice to writers, no matter where they are in their career. And I just wonder if each of you could kind of, maybe sort of pass on some tricks or lessons or advice that you sort of took away from Eric that you could sort of give to other writers who are looking to start writing.
One thing which I always remember Eric used to say was, he said, get your ideas and drop them into your back brain and just leave them there, and then just stand back and let your back brain, he called it, just let that do its business. Don't get in its way, and just write those things down. And I think that's very true. Get the ideas and just follow your characters, see where they go. Don't try and force it.
That's great advice. I
always felt that he worked incredibly hard and was incredibly prolific, and this really good craftsman with writing. But I always felt he really enjoyed it. He just loved to write. And I think that's a really important thing to remember when you're writing sometimes. Remember to love it.
I think that's good, yes. I think for me, I creative writing at university for several years, and one of the things that science fiction workshopping course, I the students up in groups to workshop. I always used to tell them, if the outcome of that is that you trust other people to get their opinions and to choose which advice to follow, which not to follow, that's a valuable lesson in itself. Somebody who really understands what you're right to help you achieve that. That's something you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. And that's what I found with Eric in 1999 when we first met. We knew what each other wanted to achieve as writers, and we each saw ways to help each other get closer to that. It's been invaluable for me, both as a professional tool for all of my writing career up to now, and even now I'm carrying those bits of advice with me. If you can find somebody like that, that'll be the single thing you can find in your writing career.
That's all fantastic advice. Before we go, maybe a sort of Una McCormack, where can people find your stories at the moment? Anything you want to plug?
You can find me on my website, unamccormack.co.uk.
Find me on my website, TonyBallantyne.com. It'll tell you what's coming on in the future there.
You can find me at keithbrook.co.uk for any links to old stuff or new stuff and news. I think the best advice I can give you if you want to find out what Eric and I did, we had a novel called Wormhole published around this time last year, and we were both extremely proud of it and loved the process of writing it, and it's had a good reception, so it'd be lovely if that found more readers.
And Infinity Plus is a great resource as well of there's Eric interviewing people and interviews with Eric and you and all sorts of other things at Infinity Plus. So yeah, check out that if you haven't already as well for more. Thank you all very, very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you, Gareth.
You've been listening to a special episode of INTERZONE Pod about the late great Eric Brown. Joining me on the show were Tony Ballantyne, Keith Brooke, and Una McCormack. You can find out more about INTERZONE at interzone.press and read stories and reviews and interviews for free in its online sister zine, IZ Digital. Thanks for listening. See you next time.